welcome to tonight's seminar with the title Kazakhstan in the Light of Russia's Invasion of Ukraine. This seminar is arranged by the Swedish Development Forum, FUF, together with the Central Asia Solidarity Groups. My name is Fanny Persson-Janssens and I work at the FUF. And we are a Swedish organization, but in English we call ourselves the Swedish Development Forum. We are a politically and religiously independent non-profit organization, and our purpose is to inform and create discussion about global development and Sweden's role in the world. And we want to contribute to knowledge, debate, and commitment for a fair and sustainable world, which we do, for example, by arranging seminars like this. I will now hand over to Frida Ekelund from Central Asia Solidarity Group, who will tell us more about this seminar.
Thank you very much. And I will start by sharing my screen with you and introduce. Now let's see here. I want to share the right one with you. Which is not working. So let me tell you about Central Asia Solidarity Groups. Are also a volunteer-driven organization based in Sweden, who started 2012 as an organization. And we are based in Malmö. We're having long-time solidarity work within the region of Central Asia. And that means the former post-Soviet states. We have Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. But we also have smaller projects, for example, in Russia and alike. And we work with long-time solidarity work in various thematic areas. But we also noticed that Central Asia is a blank spot on the global map for Swedes in particular. That's why we also combine with advocacy and information work in Sweden in order to raise awareness of the region. And this is a place for you to gain more knowledge about the region. And we are very happy to introduce Diana Kudaibergenova and Chanibek Arinov tonight at this seminar. And we will have 1 hour together. And we will start with introduction by our speakers. And then 10 minutes where also our speakers can comment on each other's lectures and ask questions to one another. And then we will open up for questions from you, the participants. So if you have questions, save them. And then you will get to raise your hand or write in the chat any questions you might have when the clock turns 6:05. So this will be the program of today. So I start with introducing Diana Kudaibergenova, assistant professor at the Department of Political Sociology at Cambridge University, UK. Thank you very much for participating, and I leave it to you.
Thank you so much, and I wanted to thank the organizers and my co-panelists for the invitation and for a very interesting discussion. Hopefully that we'll be having today. So I have brief sort of introduction of the concept. My paper in progress is called "Waiting for the War," and it is basically sort of trying to contextualize and answer the question of how does it feel on sort of like a local community level to live in the shadow of Russia and of the potential conflict for 30 years. Because what we've seen on 24th of February, the invasion of the fully fledged invasion of Ukraine by the Russian forces was something that was discussed for a long time, something that was discussed with caution, with anxiety among, different sort of groups and social groups, and it definitely formed into a very significant discourse in the post-Soviet space. We've seen other conflicts, we've seen other sort of invasions, 2008 war in Georgia was case in point. The Donbass war that started in 2014 was also something that, you know, I particularly focused on because I kept on going to Ukraine and conducting my studies there. But it's also definitely something that really influenced some of my respondents in Kazakhstan as well. So I'm really in this paper, I'm looking into how this discourse really formed over periods of time that for the 30 years of independence, at least, you know, certain groups in Kazakhstani society were expecting the type of conflict that will, and now that we have the fully-fledged war in Ukraine, there are more discussions and debates about sort of like the infrastructure, whether there are bomb shelters in the cities, whether there will be enough of food supply, whether our built infrastructure will sustain the type of war processes and war attacks if it had to happen. But I think what's really important, if we sort of try to trace it genealogically and tries to sort of get back to the idea of where the puzzle and problem arises from, I think it's really important to look into the Russian far-right discourses in the field itself that has been homing a number of different groups and people. We cannot really pinpoint just one person and say that it was his or her production. It's a very wide discourse and a very wide field of actors that have propagated since the collapse of Soviet Union the idea of Russia recolonizing certain territories around the former Soviet space, and Ukraine and Kazakhstan were integral to these discussions. So if we look, I mean, right now I'm looking into sort of published works of people on the far right in the Russian discourse. And it was very clear that these sort of ideas of annexing parts of northern Kazakhstan, for example, annexing, and then there was a big discussion whether the whole territory of Ukraine needs to be annexed or it's only like, you know, eastern part of Ukraine. And all of these discourses really floated around the Russian society, and of course overspilled across the borders, because we still share the language, we still share the forms of communication, and all of these resources were widely available, of course, to anybody in the former Soviet space. So I think it's a dangerous interplay between where the far right ideas become highly polarized, but also become very popular beyond the far right field in itself. And the actors in the Russian far right, they used to be very weak and did not really have sort of significant political backing. All of a sudden, we see that their agenda is becoming fully fledged, legitimated in this particular conflict. So of course, there is a lot of worry in over the border in Kazakhstan about, you know, the potential spillover of that discourse where Kazakhstan has been an integral part of the type of recolonization debate. And I think given the setting that this is what is happening, it's really important to sort of understand not only the everyday anxiety shared by people currently, which is, I think, is a very important aspect of looking into the type of ordinary everyday life discourses in Kazakhstani cities, but it's also very importantly, and that's where sort of, I'm a political sociologist, I'm really interested in how people respond to power relations. But I guess a lot of scholars of sort of foreign policy and IR specialists would also talk about the interrelation between these two states that did declare very sort of neighborly position, that do form in specific alliance, both formally in the Eurasian Economic Union, but also informally through a number of sort of diplomatic language. And I think this is where my particular sort of intervention lies, because I'm really interested in the division between the regime and society. And that's, again, something that I already published with Marlène Larouet in our paper that came out on January events in April this year. And we're talking about this paradigm that in Kazakhstan, we don't have the state-society division as we usually have in sort of social analysis, but we have the regime-society division instead. So regime substitutes the state in the power dimension, and regime creates both and dominates the ideas of foreign policy and the ideas of domestic policy. And in the domestic policy, for the 30 years of dictatorship of former President Nazarbayev, of course, the idea was built around the tenets of stability, inter-ethnic harmony, but also non-conflictual situation in Kazakhstan. So he built his legitimacy on a number of different aspects, including development and the sort of very developmentalistic promises. But one of them was also this idea of very sort of fearful understanding of potential conflict or potential war, and then keeping the stability in the country by saying that if we have a very strong state, by which he meant very strong authoritarian regime, then we at least avoid potential conflicts, either sort of domestic conflict, but also fully fledged wars with other states. And I think that particular sort of understanding of peace, harmony, and stability has developed into a specific value system of the society that, again, interrelates with the regime visions, but also becomes very much embedded into societal fabric across different classes, across different sort of urban, rural divide groups, where they internalize this idea that, of course, living in peace is something highly valued, but also that they want to avoid conflict at any cost, including at the cost of the political freedom and sort of further democratization. So there are a lot of sort of complex ideas on the ground, as well as what are the ways to avoid potential conflict, even though these kind of like ideas of avoidance also sit very well with the ideas of growing anxiety and sort of preparing and becoming as resilient as a community against potential conflict. So there is this idea of adaptation, the idea of avoidance, active avoidance of potential conflict, and the idea of resilience, but also significant divisions and cautious approach to, for example, inter-ethnic relations. Now, I think Kazakhstan is a very interesting country in the mix, because it is the second biggest state territorially after Russia in the former Soviet space. It has been significantly Russified during the Soviet period. We are home for a number of different multi-ethnic, but also multicultural groups and minorities. Russian is the second and very widespread language, even though we see statistically the rise of Kazakh language education, for example. And it's been a very, sort of the policy of the regime has been always accommodating of all these minorities. Of course, not in the ideal sense. I mean, it's not the strongest multicultural dimension of the state policy, but at least, there are significant steps that maybe do not exist in other post-Soviet spaces. And it's very, very important that given the conflict that was happening in Ukraine, and given the numbers of anti-war movements, anti-war in Ukraine movements for the support for Ukrainian sovereignty, there is a big question in the elephant in the room, sort of like, how does this relate back to Kazakhstan's own national identity, nation building visions? We had the change of the regime, especially after the January events. It was really clear that the Nazarbayev is gone, and it requires a rethinking of the national nation building policy that the new regime will have to offer. It's been put on hold. We haven't heard back about it yet, because possibly because of the post-traumatic, because the January. I don't want to call them January events, but basically the uprisings in January and the mass mobilization of people was quite significantly repressed and became traumatic. And another problem, obviously, that the war in Ukraine almost immediately followed after that. So the new question of sort of rethinking nation building by the new regime that came fully into power de facto after January is still on hold, and sort of will remain a big question. How the new regime will try to maneuver in this very complex field of sort of the fact that the very marginalized Russian far-right discourses became predominant and hegemonic in Russian society and Russian polity, specifically because of the war in Ukraine, and how they're going to navigate these kind of divisions, anxieties, but also expectations. And I think what I really wanted to draw on this in this paper, and in the last 2 minutes that I have, or 1 minute, is this normalization of the fact that everybody expected the conflict to happen, but they didn't know where it will fire up. And I think it really clearly shows on the agenda of sort of the colonial nature of the current, or the imperialist nature of the current Russian polity and vision. So I think this is a very important question that we need to address further in the debate, is sort of like how much expectations and how much room for the discussion was there after 1991, that this sort of the rise of imperialism in Russia would actually happen and would threaten sovereignty of all its neighbors in the former Soviet space, which I think is a very, very important aspect. But I really wanted to pay attention to this kind of like internal debates and divisions and complexities in the Kazakh society. But I should stop here because I think I'm running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this short introduction. And we will have another introduction by Shanibek Arinov, assistant professor at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. So very welcome, and I'll leave the floor to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Diana, for highlighting some of the very important topics of processes going on in the country. And I fully agree that Kazakhstan is now, I think, in a very transformative phase of its development. So we see a lot of processes on the ground in society, lots of topics being discussed, and lots of kind of finds that we have among different groups in society. And I think it's a kind of very important period of our development as a society, also as a state. But I would like to take a step back and talk about a little bit about the origins, the foreign policy of Kazakhstan, and the origins and evolution of foreign policy making in Kazakhstan, right? So because again, for 30 years, the regime in Kazakhstan, the political regime in Kazakhstan has had this self-branding as the most stable country in Central Asia, right? So all this discourse of stability that we are in Kazakhstan, we are the most stable country in Central Asia. Then it became a kind of narrative that we are the most stable country in the post-Soviet space, and this kind of narrative. But within this discourse of stability, I think foreign policy has been the most stable kind of direction, because in terms of foreign policy, we haven't seen many changes over this 30 years, right? Again, it was more or less predictable foreign policy in Kazakhstan. So again, everything seems to be more or less clear when it comes to foreign policy. So at the basics of this Kazakhstan's foreign policy has been this policy of multi-vectorism, right? When you have equally good relations with all neighboring countries. So Kazakhstan had good ties with Russia, with China, with Turkey, with the US, with the European Union, with other countries, and so on and so forth, right? For 30 years, again, we had this very stable foreign policy making in Kazakhstan. But something happened in January, which changed, I think, a lot of things in Kazakhstan, but also it changed a lot of foreign policy making in Kazakhstan. This was, again, the uprising, the bloodiest uprising in the history of Kazakhstan. In January this year, we had this mass mobilization in many cities in Kazakhstan, and later the government's brutal response from the government, and we had over 160 people killed in the streets of different cities, right? But when it comes to foreign policy, it also had some implications in terms of foreign policy, because when the government lost, my apologies, just a second, again, this happened. Again, two of my kids, and they're kind of fighting with each other. That happens, yeah. So in terms of foreign policy, when the government lost the control over the situation on 5th of January, President Tokayev appealed to a collective security treaty organization led by Russia. This is a regional collective security organization, and the response was very quick. On the same day, the CSTO decided to send its so-called peacekeeping mission to Kazakhstan for 10 days. The first troops arrived on 7th of January and then left, I think, in 10 days. And many experts who kind of look at Kazakhstan, who study Kazakhstan, were quick to say that it was the end of Kazakhstan's multi-vector foreign policy, because everyone was expecting that now, from now on, back then in January, Kazakhstan would become more dependent on Russia, right? Why? Because again, Putin involved personally to save the regime in Kazakhstan. That's why now Kazakhstan's regime, or the Tokayev regime, is indebted to Russia. So there were lots of speculations about this, but then another big thing happened, right? Which also had huge implications for Kazakhstan. That's Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February. So that was again another turning point for Kazakhstan's foreign policy, because again, as Diana mentioned, we have been experiencing this this attitude, or this kind of discourses from different Russian politicians about northern part of Kazakhstan being historically Russian lands, and kind of the sense of this insecure kind of in Kazakhstan. So having this kind of things, again, it was quite the invasion of Ukraine, of Russia into Ukraine, was quite had quite extensive political foreign policy implications for Kazakhstan. Now Kazakhstan had to balance against Russia, again, Russia being the most, the closest partner for Kazakhstan, closest political partner, geopolitical partner, cultural partner, economic partner. And now Kazakhstan found itself in a very difficult position, right? On the one hand, again, we have this close ties. On the other hand, we see this narratives or the situation in Ukraine, again, which can be easily related to the case of Kazakhstan, and the government trying to kind of find the middle, the golden middle kind of position to, again, to manage these difficulties, right? So, but on the other hand, I think, again, living in Astana, we talk a lot to different, let's say, different people involved in foreign policy decision making, and what they all say is that Kazakhstan now is under huge Russian pressure. It has been under huge Russian pressure for some time, but after January and after Russia's invasion in Ukraine, the pressure has increased, and again, the countries are kind of in a very difficult position in that sense. But on the other hand, and Kazakhstan's response to that has been quite interesting. Again, if maybe some of you may have heard President Tokayev sitting next to President Putin and saying that calling Donbass and Lugansk quasi state entities, and kind of refusing to recognize the independence of those Lugansk and Donetsk national republics. But on the other hand, I think this opens up new opportunities for Kazakhstan's foreign policy. Why? Because now Kazakhstan is more actively engaging with other countries, external countries in the region, right? First of all, again, some of the things that we kind of could possibly imagine, let's say, a couple of years ago, now becoming more kind of reality, right? So one example is President of China, Xi Jinping, coming to Kazakhstan just several weeks ago in October, and making a statement that China would support Kazakhstan's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. And of course, I think it's clear that it was a kind of more addressed to Russia, right? And we have President Erdogan saying the same kind of things, right? So recently, just last week, we had the visit by Charles Michel of the European Union. So again, it was for the first time that EU and Central Asian countries had this official summit of heads of states, right? And again, they're also trying to implement some of those projects, especially linked to connectivity, transport links, infrastructure that have been on the table for over 10 years. Maybe in a couple of years, we may find some kind of solutions for those problems, right? Again, we've been discussing this middle corridor from China through Kazakhstan, through Caspian, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey to Europe. That has been on the table for quite a long time. But maybe now it's a momentum when they will find that the different parties will find the finance for that and try to implement this practice. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that, again, the foreign policy of Kazakhstan has been stable for many, many years, but now it's a kind of a time of significant change when it comes to foreign policy. On the one hand, Kazakhstan's government found itself in a very difficult position, again, given this aggressive behavior from the Russian Federation, the aggressive rhetoric from Russian Federation in relation to Kazakhstan. This kind of the pressure, of course, that kind of limits the space for Kazakhstan's foreign policy. On the other hand, we see more active, other actors being more actively involved in Central Asia, trying to to come up with some of the solutions that would help Kazakhstan or other Central Asian countries to diversify their foreign policies. First of all, this is about China. It's about Turkey, and maybe we will see more active European Union in the future. Yeah, maybe I'll just stop here, and if there will be any questions, and then we can have a more kind of discussion, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shanibek. So, first of all, I'd like to open up for our two speakers to actually comment or ask each other questions in order to have a more vibrant and dynamic event before we actually leave the floor to our participants. So I will start with asking you, Diana, if you have any comments or anything you want to add after Shanibek's talk.
Yeah, that was very, very interesting. Again, you know, I'm not an IR specialist, but I think and I completely agree with Janibek that it's, we need to address this region, sort of the complexity of different power relations in play in foreign policy, and sort of, you know, not single it out to this kind of like geopolitical viewing of Central Asia being the backyard of Russia, or that's how it used to be portrayed. And yeah, and I think, you know, hopefully there will be a lot more discussions of sort of like the importance of the region, not just Kazakhstan, but Central Asia in general, beyond these kind of frameworks of seeing us as a periphery of Russia. And I hope that the war and hopefully the end of the war that we were all expecting very soon will change that dynamic. But I completely agree, and with what you said, Janibek, and I really enjoyed your presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And Shanibek, do you have any reflections or comments or questions listening to Diana's presentation?
Yeah. Thank you, Diana. Just one point, just I'd like to add. After the January uprising in Kazakhstan, we have seen among the expert community of especially Western countries, we've seen this return of the great game narrative. Again, Kazakhstan being described as a kind of, again, the vassal kind of country of Russia, now returning to Russia's dominance and that kind of stuff. And after, again, it's been how many months? 8 months since then. And we see that, again, Central Asian countries are not just the objects of this kind of great game. They do have this subjectivity, and in different cases, they can find the solutions, the best solutions, again, for them. So again, I would also agree with that. Okay, we shouldn't kind of treat the region as a backyard with Russia, or kind of the region where all these different countries come and just play a kind of game. So I think that's a bit misleading direction. When it comes to Diana's presentation, again, it's very interesting, and I'm looking forward to see the final result, I mean, once it's published. And again, thank you for doing this. And you mentioned that, again, one point that I would like to mention is, you mentioned that in Kazakhstan, we still have this kind of fear, right? So Kazakhstan can be next and so on. Have you, again, after various conversations to different people in Kazakhstan, I think there is also this kind of narrative that, okay, Kazakhstan was in danger before February 24th, but after the invasion, now we are safer. Why? Because Ukraine is fighting not only for its own independence, but also it's fighting for Kazakhstan's independence. So do you have kind of similar opinion, or what would you say about this? Thank you.
Yeah, I think Ukraine is fighting for the future of the whole region. But then again, and I think, you know, and I'm really, really glad that there are some discussions that are emerging right now in Russia itself, and in Kazakhstan, precisely because I know that this movement has been really, really strong in Kazakhstan. But I think the way we can sort of claim our subjectivities and hopefully fight against this very sort of looming dominance of Russian state and its imperialism in the region is by sort of decolonial movements that are very, very strong on the ground. And Kazakhstan has a very strong movement, grassroots movement in itself. And I started studying it almost more than 10 years ago. And it was already kind of like very, important dialogues were happening in sort of civil society that we need to decolonize. Now we see that certain communities in Russia itself, the minority communities like Republic of Sakha, Buryatia, they also have these grassroots movements talking about the idea of sort of decolonizing Russia. And I think, I don't like the predictions, but I think if we had to speak of the scenario, sort of post-war scenario of how to avoid further dangers and anxiety that Russia is causing its neighbors and its own sort of minority groups within its own borders, is to think about how we can open up this debate on decolonization. I know it's going to be a very painful, very difficult and challenging road to discuss these issues, but hopefully the end of the war will pave the way for these discussions. In terms of Ukraine, I think Ukraine is obviously fighting for its own independence and sovereignty, but I'm not the first one to say it. My colleague, what was Kassym-Jomart said, had a very emotional appeal recently in one of the talks in Ukrainian spaces that Ukraine is fighting for all of us, and Ukraine is fighting for the independence and sovereignty in the whole region, because it will create the precedent that sovereignty of any post-Soviet state should not be questioned based on basically very, very strange and made-up rhetoric that can be addressed to any of the states in post-Soviet space. We all can be called, inventions of the Leninist nationality policy, including Russia itself, which I think that's the precedent that we all need to fight. Really, is that we have our sovereign borders, and they should be respected by all means.
Thank you. Do we have kind of time for one small question to Diana?
2 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Just briefly. So you mentioned this grassroots movements in Kazakhstan. Yeah. So we see this discussions happening in Astana and Almaty. But beyond Astana and Almaty, how do you think? Again, your personal impression. How widespread it is, because I've been to Shymkent just several days ago, and people there talk about this war, but what they talk is that not kind of pro-Ukrainian necessarily. They do not support Russia or Putin, but at the same time, they are very, very much anti-Americanist. And again, the kind of being anti-Americanist and partly saying, okay, Russia had some justifications to invade Russia, some reasons to invade Ukraine, and
I think he froze.
Sorry. Yeah. So how do you think? To what extent it's how widespread is this movement? Sorry.
Well, decolonial movement, which is important, is calling on the colonial nature of the past, but also how coloniality is sort of in the production of knowledge in the hierarchies has remained even since colonialism per se, let's say, is over. If we take Soviet Union as an empire, and I think part of the question that you're asking is precisely in that Russia still continues to dominate the production of knowledge, both about the history and about the present, and it's obviously it's feeding a lot of its sort of powerful propaganda discourses about this sort of like, it's a very Russia against the West, collective West conflict. It's not really Ukraine that's fighting the war. It's the US that is engaging and sort of intervening in our more or less regional politics that should be predominantly dominated by Russia and so on. And I think the decolonial movement, precisely what it has to offer, especially, and I think it's very important that it comes from not from the Russia's core, right? Moscow is really, really far from decolonizing, but it comes from sort of Sakha in Yakutia and Kazakhstan, even though it's Almaty and Astana, maybe okay. But once it becomes the movement that is able to change these dynamics of power, of knowledge production, and change the dynamics of sort of like the hierarchies of how we perceive the role of Russia. Of course, it will take time. And of course, that movement has to grow and sort of acquire particular localized languages, including speaking in Kazakh and finding specific discourse that wouldn't sound too alien or Western to the people sort of like in Shymkent, in Karaganda, and other places that I think partially share the incentive, but do not yet have the like linguistic apparatus or the type of like, terminology to speak about. I think it's, of course, I'm not completely sort of overly optimistic that it's going to be a fully fledged movement, but it could be. We know that the book by Madina Tlastanova on decolonial thought has been translated into Kazakh, and it's coming out. It's already available in Russian in Kazakhstan, but it's coming out in Kazakh, I think, in a couple of months. And hopefully that will be sort of something that can sip through precisely in this change of dynamics in knowledge production and knowledge hierarchies. And and people just start realizing that something has to be changed. But I think Russia continues to predominantly influence the media and just in general, these kind of like mainstream discourse, that it's a very us against the rest of the world kind of debate, and collective West being the villain and the enemy. And I think parts of Kazakhstan's independence would also depend on how far we can change and sort of own our own discourse, and not allowing Russian propaganda to take over in all sorts of channels where it tries to sort of navigate and dominate our public space, unfortunately, till today.
Thank you so much. So I will let our participants in the room pose questions. And if you raise your hand, then as it's a recorded event, we might hear you, but you can also feel free to write in the chat if you are shyer. So I'm gonna see if I can see anyone raising their hand. We have someone saying, thanks a lot for your interesting talks. And we have one question. Do you think Tokayev welcoming Russians fleeing the mobilization puts the country at risk in terms of its relationship with Russia? Is there any one of you who would like to go first? As it's not directed to anyone particular.
Okay, maybe I'll try. Thank you for your question, Tatiana. And we've been discussing this draft orders from Russia in Kazakhstan for over kind of months now. I don't really think that it can become an issue between Kazakhstan and Russia, political issue, let's say, at the highest level. At the moment, we already have lots of this tensions at the highest level between presidents or between governments. And I don't really think that this draft orders would become another topic to add to this complexity. Two reasons. First of all, I don't think that it's going to have long-time effect, right? So again, we don't know, we can't predict, but I think the mobilization is over, as the Kremlin yesterday commented, but again, we can expect another wave of mobilization. But I can judge from Almaty, from Astana, during the first weeks, we had lots of Russians here in the cities, but again, in our everyday life, and if you go to streets, we don't see now very many people in the streets because again, there is official statistics about that. Many of them have left Kazakhstan to other places. So basically, again, the Kazakhstan is not the final destination for many people fleeing the mobilization in Russia. So again, I would say no. Possibly again, if we're gonna see another big wave of mobilization, this may change the situation, but at this stage, again, I don't think this to be an issue at the political level.
Thank you. Diana, do you have any comments?
I think I would rephrase the question to address sort of where did it come from? Because I think there was a lot of discourse when Russian anti-mobilization migration started. There was a lot of discussion of sort of like, will that group of people, ethnic Russians or those Russian citizens, become a liability for the receiving states? And Kazakhstan is not the only one that receives them. Georgia is also has homed quite a lot of Russian sort of anti-mobilization migrants, let's call them like that, because there are other words of how people use that in that discourse. And I think this kind of understanding of liability, of them being a liability, comes from an empirical but also conceptual understanding. We know that kind of like the kin state will, and Russia in the case is kin state, can go on and decide and sort of open the precedent of protecting its co-nationals or co-ethnics rights in a neighboring state, and basically intervene militarily in order to sustain the policy of sort of like anti-Russification and so what is called now Russophobic policies. That happened in Crimea under that pretext, more or less, but changed because it wasn't ethnic Russian. That happened in 2008 war in Georgia. So of course there is this like kind of like anxiety in the public discourse. But I think we also need to accommodate for these groups of people as well, sort of in order not to marginalize them further than the status was already pushing them to feel. So yeah, I'm not in the business of predictions, but I think, yeah, because there is this sort of historical precedent and in the study of literature nationalism in post-Soviet space, there is this kind of concept of kin states and kin minorities. And Roger's Brubaker work, sort of the nexus between the kin state, host state, and kin minorities, which created conflicts in the past. But I wouldn't call Russians a liability. I think they, first of all, this is probably not going to be the long-term migration, and second of all, yeah, they do not seem to cause much problem so far, but it might be. I mean, there are sort of localized tensions and discrimination, which is a different question, but not geopolitical.
Thank you. And Tatiana also says thank you. And we have another question in our chats. Thank you both for sharing your insights. My question is, how much Kazakhstan is dependent on import from the Russian exports to Russia? Is the trade between the countries any possible way for Russia to dominate the politics in Kazakhstan? So I will start by giving the word to Shanibek.
The EU is biggest trading partner for Kazakhstan, but if we take individual countries, states, Russia becomes the biggest trading partner for Kazakhstan with something about 19 billion USD trade turnover last year. Most of that, again, in terms of Kazakhstan's export to Russia, it's mostly about raw materials, including hydrocarbons, oil, gas, and so on and so forth. When it comes to imports, if I do remember it correctly, it's machinery, agricultural products, and then other stuff. So basically, Russia is quite a significant economic partner for Kazakhstan, a trade partner for Kazakhstan. Another big issue for Kazakhstan is that Kazakhstan's biggest oil exporting pipeline goes through Russia. So I think about 70–80% of Kazakhstan's oil exported to Europe through this pipeline, CPC. And in March, we had Russia shutting down this pipeline for the first time. This year, the reason was, I think, related, I don't remember, some technical issues. Then in May, they shut down it for the second time. The reason was ecological harm. And then for the third time, they found some kind of World War II, the kind of mines from World War II period kind of stuff. And And we see that, again, the interpretation here is that Russia is using this pipeline as if the pressure tool, the geopolitical tool against Kazakhstan. So because all the shutdowns comes after something very significant. For the first time, it was Kazakhstan's deputy head of president's office visiting Brussels and giving this open interview for the first time after the January and after the war, where he was saying that Kazakhstan won't help Russia to minimize the kind of the effects of sanctions. And for the second time, I think it followed another thing. Then President Tokayev's visit and speech in St. Petersburg was followed with the third kind of shutdown of the pipeline. So basically, in terms of, again, trade and economic kind of pressure, Kazakhstan is quite vulnerable in that sense against those kind of things.
Thank you so much. Diana, do you have anything to add, question or comment?
Yeah, I agree with Janibek, and I think that's a very good sort of portrayal of the relationship that were happening already. And I think Russia will sort of try to influence the politics in Kazakhstan and try to dominate it as long as our regime remains very undemocratic and sort of the logic of the regime construction is based on selection of elites rather than the election of elites. And if we had a more sort of what's it called, accountable government, accountable to citizens, then we would have seen a different sort of foreign policy and a different also intervention probably. Of course, it would still depend on very much the aspect of our economy that is very resource extractivist based and, you know, sort of exporting raw resources using the territory of Russia. Again, going back to the colonial idea that all the export routes were built through Russia, even though there are alternative routes that were not developed even for the oil pipelines through the Caspian, Trans-Caspian route, through Turkey and so on. A lot of these projects were kind of like frozen down. Another sort of infrastructure project that is sort of developing now is through the China's One Belt, One Road perspective, but also through China-Kazakh relations. But I think if the government was a little bit more accountable, a little bit more democratic and actually elected by the people, it would have had a different way of navigating and responding to the people of Kazakhstan rather than feeling that they owe or are under control of the regime in Russia. Sorry for a very blunt and bold statement, but that's what the January events also showed us. That's what people were demanding. We don't have the accountability of our government. We do not have open and contested elections where we can elect our even governors, regional governors of our cities and regions. Forget about the accountable parliament or an accountable cabinet of ministers.
Thank you very much. So we had 2 questions and we have time for at least another one. So don't be shy and raise your hand or write something in the chat. We have Aina who has a question. Please share with us.
Yeah, I thought about maybe this is for both of you, but I thought about what you said, Diana, about national identity, because I'm doing a course in ontological security right now, and it's resonated a lot with what you said. But I thought what you both think, like if Kazakhstan is to kind of draw up a new national identity that is not just post-Soviet, that is not just about Russification, that is not so tightly knit to Russia, what would it draw on, do you think? Like in your work with the grassroots movement, what do you see? Like, is it there like a wider Central Asian community, or is it more leaning towards like China or the EU? Like, how do you view that?
Thank you, Aina. We start with Diana on this one.
Thank you for a very good question. I think in the grassroots, we have very sort of diverse discussions of what Kazakhstan should represent and what should the national identity be. We had a very strong and sort of populist right-wing movements and so-called national patriots, as they called them, so Kazakh national patriots, but they kind of were highly marginalized and lost their momentum in the 2010s and sort of like up up until 2020, we see how the agenda becomes a lot more dispersed across sort of different spontaneous groups, because the agenda is obviously very, very important. It's the further sort of empowerment of the Kazakh language, the use of Kazakh language in public space and sphere. And it used to be the agenda dominated predominantly by far right, or by the right sort of movements and parties. And now it became kind of like a very public dialogue, not just among Kazakhs, but also among some of the ethnic minorities sort of. And I think the war in Ukraine really spurred this debate of sort of like, if we do have sovereignty, if we do have independence, then we'll probably at least somehow use the state language in at least a colloquial or whatever superficial knowledge we have of it. So I think it's really, really interesting dimension, because I'm a scholar of nationalism. So for me, it's very, very interesting to see how a very stale agenda of the national patriots slowly moved towards kind of like a centrist approach. And we have definitely grassroots sort of pro-democracy groups, youth movements, social movements that emerged after 2019, after Nazarbayev resigned, which offered a very big window of opportunity for new movements to emerge, movements that are not sort of former political elites or those, because of our opposition traditionally came from the regime itself. They used to occupy big positions within the regime structure, and then all of a sudden they became opponents to the regime. So since 2019, we've seen the upsurge of movements that are completely grassroots, that had very little to do with the regime in the past. We have maybe not as many new faces, but at least there are some very interesting debates and discussions going on the ground. Unfortunately, for Kazakhstan, these movements do not formalize into strong sort of infrastructures of agenda setting or strong opposition that could be institutionalized. But maybe that's the type of thing that we need to live through. I don't know. So, and the debate in those movements is the kind of the invention of the new civicness. Not the civicness that the regime used to offer, sort of this Kazakhstani approach that was really top-down led projects of sort of, all state programs that never really managed to achieve anything, and basically used the bureaucracy apparatus and kind of like completely, used all the forces that the state was doing with these policies and programs like Mangalekye, Eternal Nation, and so on. Used it completely for the bureaucratic apparatus that was already loyal to the regime, but did not really sip through, further into the grassroots movements that could emerge. So actually, there is a very interesting agenda of sort of this new civicness and what would it mean. And I think this the idea of this new civicness kind of already suffered quite a lot of really traumatic experiences. January protests being like one of the biggest blows to civil society in general, because it was highly repressed. And people are now scared. I mean, some people are anxious about whether the big mobilizations are going to bring good results and so on. So, and the sort of war in Ukraine obviously directly affects how the Kazakhstani society and these movements are forming their understandings and sort of ideas of what the national identity should be. So I think, I guess we would have to wait for maybe a year, maybe a few months. Maybe we'll need to wait till the end of the war, or if, God forbid, if it becomes really prolonged conflict, then we will definitely see the transformation of that. What kind of is on a positive note from what I've seen from my ethnographies and interviews with these grassroots movements is that the regime is listening to them. So there is a dialogue, quite strangely, between the regime and these movements, maybe not sort of open dialogue, but the regime is trying to appropriate some of the agendas and some of the slogans that the movements are proposing. So maybe we will see the burst of new civicness at some point. Tokayev so far offered this program of New Kazakhstan, but people are quite disappointed because it's New Kazakhstan or new banner under the same old rules and agenda that people don't see many changes about. So let's hope for the new civic project emerging from the people rather than from the regime.
Thank you. Shanibek, do you have anything to add?
No, Dan, I think, has captured it perfectly.
Thank you very much. Let's see if we have another question, as we have 5 minutes that we can use for the curiosity of our participants. We only have a comment, highly topical, very informative, most interesting. But is there another question? Nothing yet. Then I would like to take, Tatiana is asking, have you noticed an increased popularity of Kazakh language studies in Kazakhstan after the beginning of the war? Who would like to go first? Diana.
I've seen, yes, the people trying to organize kind of new platforms on social media. There are classes, there are discussions in the public, mainly coming from Russians who are citizens of Kazakhstan. And I see at least a certain popularity of language classes, yes, in cities.
Why do you think that is?
Sorry.
Do we have an explanation for why that is?
I think I don't know the explanation yet, but I see that they're becoming popular. And also another thing that is, I guess, important is that how quickly Kazakh language occupied the rallies, because we have rallies now quite frequently in Kazakhstan. The anti-war and pro-Ukraine rally in early March. I've seen quite a lot of banners in Kazakh language and sort of Kazakh and Ukrainian flags, held together and so on. And that's a very interesting visual sort of representation, because before we had either bilingual or predominantly Russian banners in the rallies, and now we have predominantly Kazakh language messages, which is really interesting.
Thank you. Janibek, comment.
Yeah, the changes are quite obvious, especially coming from Astana, which has long been a Russian-speaking city mostly. We see many people kind of trying to speak Kazakh, right? So it's not just about ethnic Kazakhs, some of them who don't speak Kazakh, but again, they are trying to speak Kazakh. We also see other ethnic minorities, again, going to Kazakh courses of kind of creating some kind of platforms or speaking clubs here in Astana, or maybe the similar kind of things that are happening in other cities, right? So I've seen many people, I think about 12 people, I think, who intentionally now refuse to use Russian, even if they do not kind of are fluent in Kazakh. Again, I had some of the kind of colleagues and friends or acquaintances coming in saying, okay, please can you speak to me only in Kazakh? Yes, I do know that my Kazakh is not kind of perfect, but I will try to learn to speak Kazakh only to me. So this kind of things, again, people intentionally, again, kind of trying to learn Kazakh, because the language has become, I think, very important. I don't know, one of the markers, I think, of this new identity. It's a very important topic, I mean, in society, right? So yeah, we see this the increase of popularity of Kazakh, but in terms of to what extent it's a long-term process, short-term, or what are the consequences? Again, it's difficult to judge at this point.
Thank you very much. And that will be the last word for tonight. Thank you so much for participating and sharing your expertise on these topics. And also thank you for participating. And I'd like to remind you that both the organizations co-hosting are member-based. So it's possible to become a member if you want to influence or just want to support the work that we do. So with that, I think you all do have anything else funny to say or add?
No, nothing to add. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you so much. And have a nice evening.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.